and those of you who are online joining us. It's a treat to have you wherever you are today. We are so blessed to have this Arts Discovery Series back in fashion. Next week features Dwayne Hartford from Child's Play, and he is going to be talking about Child's Play, but it's also, oh my gosh, if you haven't been to a Child's Play production, you will, it's really, really worth it, even if you don't have little kids. I just go and love it. And then Brett Valiant, who's going to play the organ on the following week, and he's the organist from Organ Stop Pizza, the resident organist there. And I didn't want to insult Jeremy by saying that he's going to take the organ to new heights, because Jeremy already takes it to new heights, right? Yes. So enough said for me. I would like to introduce Ben Baer with AZ Music Fest.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, good evening, La Casa de Cristo Lutheran Church. I'm so excited to be here tonight. As Jennifer was saying, actually, before I even get started, I need to thank Jennifer for helping organize this wonderful series, Gary and the tech crew for getting everything working in here. It's amazing how quickly so many things can just sort of happen when you have people that know what they're doing, teching your whole show. So you all are so wonderfully blessed to have such a capable and dedicated staff here. Seriously, I would give them a round of applause. Goodness gracious, especially over this last year, my gosh. So, as Jennifer said, my name is Ben Baer. I am the manager of education, youth performance, and community programming for Arizona Music Fest in North Scottsdale. And a number of you may be familiar with Arizona Music Fest. I saw some of you grabbed our brochure in the back, and that is one of our classic pieces that we do. We're very excited to be launching our 30th, well, this is technically our 31st, but it'll be our 30th anniversary season this year. We're gonna ignore last year. We're so excited to be bringing concerts back into North Scottsdale, obviously primarily presenting over at Highlands Church, but for our Festival Orchestra Week, which has always been this incredibly special jewel in the middle of our year, we're always so thankful to be able to present that right here on this stage, and I'm very excited to be standing where none other than Maestro Moody stands as a T-Rex conducting the orchestra. So, as I mentioned, I am the manager of education, youth performance, and community programming for Arizona Music Fest. That is an extremely long title for every letter in my name. I have another word added to my title. But buried somewhere in there, you might notice the words community programming. And this is what this lecture I'm going to give today is more or less a part of. So all of our community programming is wrapped up in a project that we call Music Alive, which meets in the community room at our space there, and it's a series of lectures, discussion groups, film screenings, and it's all based on the Music Fest season. So as I mentioned, we've got our 30th anniversary this year. These are a few of the acts and artists that are coming through, and as I'm planning for what we're going to do in Music Alive, I just get to listen to a ton of music. I have a really fun job. I get to sit around listening to music all day and figuring out fun things to talk about. And as the musicologist or as the education guy, the community guy for an arts organization like Arizona Music Fest, when I engage with communities, I recognize that I'm primarily engaging with audiences. So our expectation isn't that everybody that comes to a concert is also themselves a musician, but that they're people that enjoy listening to music. And that's what my programming really sort of boils down to, is helping people become the best listeners that they can be when they're thinking about listening to music. My goal is to engage folks with music they're already familiar with, introduce new music they might not be as familiar with, and just sort of grow that listening practice, open those ears up so that we can engage all the more with this incredible art form that we all do. So today's lecture is going to involve a lot of listening. I've got a lot of musical examples that we're going to go through today over the course of a short amount of time. I'm going to have a playlist for you if you'd like to continue the listening later on. I'll send that to Jennifer and she can make that available however you get information from these lectures. Because what we're going to do today is we're going to focus on one of our acts coming in this year. And let's see if I can actually reach my computer in the back. There we are. It's a project we have coming called Ray on My Mind. And as you can probably guess, this is a celebration of Ray Charles's music, our title for the show is a bit of a pun, combining Ray Charles's name as well as his seminal classic, Georgia on My Mind. And so as I'm preparing myself for our Music Alive season, I think through what music this man has. So I get to sit down, I listen through his catalog, and I get to listen and listen and listen. And there were a few things that occurred to me. Number one, which I'm sure is a shock to none of you, his music is fantastic. It is incredible music from soup to nuts. You cannot find something that isn't absolutely fabulous in this catalog. Sinatra called him the genius for a reason. And so as I'm thinking through this, I became, okay, so what are some things that I'm curious about as I'm hearing these pieces? What am I noticing? What am I wondering about? And what really occurred was the status that Ray Charles holds as the progenitor of soul music. So this uniquely American genre of music that's born out of only the melting pot, the swirl of people and cultures that we have here in this country. And so what I was wondering about is, obviously this man has an incredible catalog. He has an incredible reach of influences. He influences Elvis Presley and Aretha Franklin. He influences Roger Waters. So many people draw from the well of Ray Charles, which then inevitably leads us to the question, well, who were his influences? What brought him to this place, not only to make incredible music, but to make a uniquely new musical genre? And so you're sort of going back and you're listening through, like, who was it that influenced him? And he drew on a number of influences. Ray Charles was born in the 1930s. These are a handful of artists that he would have been entrenched in at that time. And so when we think about soul music, we have a handful of styles that are swirling into this here. We've got jazz, we've got blues, we've got rhythm and blues. And as we think about those styles, we can think about some of these musicians in particular. And these are musicians that Ray Charles specifically cited as influences to him. So as a pianist, Ray Charles was very heavily influenced by Art Tatum, Nat King Cole, Charles Brown, the blues pianist. As a showman, he was heavily influenced by Louis Jordan and Louis Armstrong. And you can see some of those effects if you go and watch some of the archive videos, or you listen to some of their tunes. You can see how closely tied he is to how they perform their music. So when Ray Charles is going through and he's creating his music, he essentially has this genre that he makes. It's this amalgam of Nat King Cole tunes. He's just recording those. He's obviously a prodigious jazz piano player, and he's also heavily influenced by gospel music. And ooh, we'll just skip slides. That's fun. Well, this isn't quite as, there we go. Let's see if I can get back one more. Well, we'll stay on this one. So, this group here was particularly influential for Ray Charles. And so as we pointed out, Art Tatum and Charles Brown and these various artists, in addition to that, he was heavily influenced by one of the singers from a group called the Pilgrim Travelers, specifically this man on the right who I drew a nice little circle around, Jesse Whittaker. And Whittaker's voice in particular is what Ray Charles sort of patterned himself after. And so as we're thinking about the style here, I wanted us to first get a little bit of an idea of that gospel sound and how it relates to Ray Charles's music. So let's see if I can get the... Not this one. Can you go to the video before it? Not quite. Let's see if we can go back. All right, go forward one, and forward one more, and forward one more. Here we go.
Done the best I can. I want my crown. Yes, I want my crown. Lord, I want my crown. Yes, I want my crown. Lord, when I've done, yes, I want my crown. All I can. Yes, I want my crown. I want my crown. Yes, I want my crown. Lord, I want my crown. Yes, I want my crown. Well, I've been stumbling. Yes, I want my crown. Falling down. Yes, I want my crown. Oh, sometime level, Lord, to the ground. Yes, I want. Yeah, but when I've done, yes, I want my crown. All I can, Lord, I want my crown. Yes, I want my Lord, I want my crown. Yes, I want my crown.
So without commenting on it, now I'm going to move into a Ray Charles track, Hit the Road, Jack. Let's go to the next slide. So we can see some connections here. Are we catching those little bits that are in our ears? We're seeing some connection between the soloist and his essentially congregation, these small groups of folks. With Ray Charles, he has the Rayettes. With Jesse Whittaker, he's got the other folks, the Pilgrim Travelers. We're essentially seeing some creeping in going on here. So I'm thinking about this connection here, and then I'm wondering about, well, how did he go about really synthesizing this style? So I'm listening to a few more tunes, and I realized that he had a few tunes that were actually pretty familiar even outside of himself. So we can go to the next slide. And in particular, there's a song here that I was really curious about, which is a gold gospel tune by a group called the Southern Tones, who were a set of musicians that were part of this golden age of gospel music in the 1940s. And they have a song that many of you might recognize called "It Must Be Jesus." Let's go ahead and have a listen to that, because it might sound a little familiar.
Oh, there's a man going around. Oh, yeah. There's a man going around taking names. Oh, Lord. No, he took my mother's name.
Is anybody catching that song? What this might be? I'm actually going to play the Ray Charles song that this reminded me of. Let's go ahead and go to this next one.
It's right there. You got it.
This is from the movie Ray. This is obviously a stylized version with Jamie Foxx.
Now you go ahead and play. I'm gonna close these drapes. I don't want no neighbors looking in.
Well, I got a woman way over town. It's good to me. Oh, yeah. I got a woman way over town.
Ray,
It's good to me. Oh, yeah.
Ray,
Give me money.
Ray, that's sacrilegious.
What?
It's a gospel song.
I know what it is. I wrote it. I mean, you told me to find my own voice. Well, B, this is it.
So it's such a fascinating moment there where he starts playing this song so earnestly, and Kerry Washington's character very earnestly comes over and prevents him from doing this and doesn't quite understand what's happening here. And I find it so fascinating that it wasn't just that he took a song and he was like, let me just make this thing out of it. He felt very ardently that this is where his voice was truly rooted. So when we talk about someone having roots in gospel music or soul having roots in gospel music, it's kind of fun that in reality, it really did jump off the page as gospel music. And now, what I found really funny as I was going through that is that it wasn't just one way. It wasn't just that gospel tunes became soul tunes. It went the other way as well. Let's go to the next slide there. And in the same way that Ray Charles would have taken this gospel tune, "It Must Be Jesus," and turned it into "I've Got a Woman," the same thing happened the other direction. So we listened to "Hit the Road Jack" a minute ago, and actually that song was then appropriated by another group called the Angelic Gospel Singers into a song called "It's the Holy Ghost." So let's have a listen to that, see if we can catch what some of those similarities are. So just to be clear, could everybody hear how they were connected to each other? All right, great. It's maybe not the most subtle example, but it's really interesting. And so this got me thinking about what was this type of exchange like? Like, how did this really work out? So today, if we go to the next slide, hopefully we can just advance through these things. Maybe my clicker will start working. There's sort of this question, is nothing sacred? And so there are four things we're going to kind of run through today as we talk about this. So the first question is, I think it's working now. The first question is, well, let's talk about what soul music is. We can talk about the influence of gospel music on soul music, because again, the thing that differentiates soul in a lot of ways is that mix of the gospel in it. We're going to survey some of these borrowed tunes, so hopefully we'll have a few more laughs as we talk about how these musicians are just sort of, casing, they're copying and stealing everything. And finally, we'll actually kind of do a little bit of a dive into history and see maybe some precedents for what we see going on here in this exchange. So we're going to start off with that first question: what is soul? The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, stand up, Northeast Ohio. Whatever. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame actually has a wonderful definition of soul music where it talks about how it's music that arose out of the black experience in America through the transmutation of gospel and rhythm and blues into a form of funky, secular testifying. So it's a really fun way of defining things. Musicologists, we really enjoy coming up with like definitions that can use words like transmutation when we talk about music. I don't know if you've like heard music theorists talk about entrainment, where we like steal things from physics and we're like, it's a music term. It's not. But what's really fun about this is that it really does talk about the way this intensely intricate and important connection between these two genres. And so as we think about soul, there are two influences in particular that I want to point out and honor before we move into the gospel side. And the first is the blues. The blues has a really heavy influence on so much American music. It's born out of the American South. It's born out of these rural areas. And one of the major elements that you're going to find coming from the blues into a lot of other genres are these chord progressions. So when you're listening to a piece of music, and as Americans, we're like, that sounds pretty bluesy. The thing that we're thinking about in a lot of ways are these progressions. Those are the chord progressions that we're hearing. There's some melodic things in there. There's a ton of other things. This is very, very brief. And specifically to Ray Charles, his influence in the blues was, goodness gracious, was Charles Brown, whose lovely face I have there in a little circle for us. In addition to the blues, a very important element that goes into soul is rhythm and blues. So rhythm and blues took a lot of that blues style, moved it into the city, and expanded the size of these bands. So as we reflect back on that video of Hit the Road Jack, and we see the Rayettes standing in the middle of the stage, and Ray Charles over there in a grand piano, and a big band over here, and a rhythm section over here, that's something that came out of the rhythm and blues genre as well. These larger bands, these heavier rhythm sections, these emphases on drums and bass. And Louis Jordan, who again will be on the playlist, we won't listen to these guys right now, but he'll be on the playlist that I'll have for you at the end here, really was one of the great popularizers of that particular style of music. And then as we mentioned, we talked about the influence of gospel into soul music. And so we think about the gospel influence on soul, and a great person that we can use to sort of talk about those influences that would have been going on in Ray Charles's life is actually musician Sam Cooke. How many folks here are familiar with Sam Cooke and Sam Cooke's music? Okay, generally speaking, very popular guy, ubiquitous artist of his time. But the reason Sam Cooke is such a wonderful figure to look at as we talk about this movement of styles from gospel into soul is because Sam Cooke originally came up as a part of a gospel group called the Soul Stirrers. So we've talked so far about the Southern Tones and the Pilgrim Wanderers, Pilgrim Travelers, and now we have the Soul Stirrers. And this type of male quartet or male quintet group is going to play a major role in leading into soul music. So I've got a couple of listening examples here focusing around Sam Cooke. The first is actually him singing with the Soul Stirrers. He's singing a tune called Nearer to Thee. So let's just try to capture a vision for what his voice sounded like when he was singing in this gospel context.
Standing near, the congregation was singing a tune in a voice that was loud and clear.
So the fun part about being on this side of the group is that I can see all of you. And so when I hear Sam Cooke's voice come on, it's one of the only times I hear someone listening to gospel music and like legitimately swooning. But the reason that we're swooning is because of his soul music as well. We associate his voice so perfectly with this style.
If you ever change your mind about leaving me behind, it to me. Bring your sweet loving, bring it on home to me.
Bring it on home to me. That voice can do so many wonderful things. It can testify and it can entreat. It's such a beautiful voice. Now, Sam Cooke was also part of this group of folks whose music was appropriated back and forth between gospel and soul music. So Sam Cooke actually wrote a song for the Soul Stirrers called Stand By Me, Father. This isn't him singing. This will be Johnny Taylor.
Oh, Father, you've been my friend. Now that I'm in trouble, stand by me to the end. Oh, Lord. Oh, I want you to stand by, stand by.
So there's something kind of interesting. Did anybody pick up on what happened at the end of that example there? That was actually picked up by another soul artist here, Benny King, and sort of expanded on into another song that some of you may remember. Oh. Did you catch it? Thank you, Logan. Let's see.
Stand by me. And darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand now. Stand by me. Stand by me.
So again, I know it's subtle, but it's pretty amazing how aware these musicians were of one another, how influenced they were by one another, and how much they played around with each other's songs. I think it's such a wonderful, like, fervent creativity that's going on at this time. There we go. So we've got the gospel style kind of in our ears now from listening to some of the examples we've had and using Sam Cooke as a reference. And so what I want to do is kind of point out a couple of these elements that would have been there that made gospel music. And on the side here, you'll see the Fisk University Jubilee Singers, who were a really important group in American cultural history. They were this incredible group of singers that would go around and were responsible for popularizing Negro spirituals and gospel music very, very early on, through traveling around through the American South and into the North to really help spread this music and help it become popular. Now, within the gospel style, there's a few things that are really salient features. They really stand out. And the first is obviously call and response. We've heard a lot of that, whether it was Sam Cooke with the Soul Stirrers or Ray Charles and the Rayettes, or we've heard that in a number of different places where you have someone kind of shouting through and other people kind of singing along with them. Now, call and response is actually rooted in a number of different traditions, and there's actually a really fascinating, I know that for our conversation here, we're specifically talking about like gospel music, like black gospel music here in America, but call and response singing actually has a really interesting tradition in like Gaelic Irish psalm singing as well. It's a tradition called lining out, where you'd have a pastor that's standing in the front and they're singing through the psalms, and as they're singing the psalm, the congregation is joining them at different parts. And it has the same effect as does the call and response that's part of American gospel music. Additionally, there's this emphasis on repetition. We're going to talk about how, essentially you have pieces being written for illiterate congregations. And so what you try to do is distill pieces of scripture or tenets of the faith into these repeatable phrases that you're able to just have the congregation singing over and over again while your leader kind of riffs over top of that. And then there are a couple of themes that typically come out of American gospel music as well. So sorrow, liberation, and jubilee. These are a few tunes that you may or may not be familiar with. These will be on the playlist as well. You can find a lot of these on the Library of Congress website, and it's really an amazing jukebox they have there. So when we think about gospel music, there's also the gospel history. Obviously, as we consider this art form, it's valuable for us to remember that this is born out of American chattel slavery, which is a particular type of slavery where people are treated as property. There's not really an opportunity or a means of escape from that. And so there's a heaviness that's sort of laid on these folks. And so again, as we think about illiterate congregations not having an opportunity to learn how to read, using song and using repetition to teach the gospel was really, really valuable. So it's in the sort of soil of slavery, but it's heavily influenced and rooted in the blues by artists like Sally Martin and Willie Mae Ford Smith, who influenced then groups of charismatic Christians called the Holy Rollers that would kind of power through the South and be testifying, encouraging people to sort of hoop and holler as they went along. A really important figure around this time as we're getting into the 30s and 40s is a pianist by the name of Thomas Dorsey, who sort of plays, he works in both of these fields, both as a pianist for blues artists like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, but then he also was himself a very prodigious gospel music writer. And when he would go on tour with these artists, he would actually do essentially like revival settings, where he'd bring together groups of gospel musicians and have these incredible like musical bursts that were going on. Thomas Dorsey was also responsible for overseeing a number of these gospel quartets that we've talked about. So whether it was the Pilgrim Travelers or the Soul Stirrers, he also had a hand in helping form groups like the Dixie Hummingbirds and would sort of shepherd them early in their career. Thomas Dorsey also was influential with Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Mahalia Jackson. And this is where we really get into more of the golden age of American gospel music. So we have these quartet singers like the Dixie Hummingbirds, and we're starting to see some stylistic things happening. We're starting to see a little bit more of that sort of shouting from the leader going on. We'll hear that as we listen to the Dixie Hummingbirds. But also Sister Rosetta Tharpe is a really important figure in stylizing that type of singing, because Rosetta Tharpe is often thought of as one of the early rock and roll musicians. So there's a lot of musicians that are influenced by her, and she's coming out of that gospel tradition as well. So to kind of get in our ear the type of sounds that would have been swirling around Ray Charles at the time around the 1940s and going into the 1950s, I'm going to play a little bit from the Dixie Hummingbirds.
Do you feel all right? Say yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you feel all right, say yeah.
Yeah.
If you feel like clapping your hands, say yeah.
Yeah.
If you feel like patting your feet, say yeah. If you got anything to shout about, say yeah. I like to tell you the reason I shout right here. The Lord woke me up this morning when my eyes came open, I was clothed in my right mind. I could move and live. I was able to do. That's the reason you see me shout.
So of any of the tracks that are going to be in the playlist that I'll send you at the end of this, this is the one that I would encourage you to go back and listen to. That is about 40 seconds from an 8.5-minute recording of them riffing on this song, and it is absolutely magnificent. Every moment of it is just so exciting. And so we're seeing some of these styles, and we're sort of really getting an idea for what Ray Charles is going to be writing into. So when you've got these sort of high pitches and these low pitches that for him are in the rhythm and blues context, so he's using very heavy electric bass to keep that sound down there. And so we're seeing more or less the waters that he's swimming in. So Ray Charles, born in 1930, as he grows up, he's hearing a lot of these. And we talked about how one of his first hits, I Got a Woman, borrowed heavily from the song It Must Be Jesus. Now, while it was one of the earliest versions of that type of borrowing, he was far from the first. So what we're going to do now is enter into a little bit of a survey here of some of these borrowed tunes. And we're going to start with Ray Charles because he's the reason that we're here. So we're going to start with him. And I'm going to give you another example of how he borrowed music. And so the exchange that he had is actually a song by a group called the Zion Harmonizers, another one of these classic quartets called Leave That Liar Alone. And you might know what song this is going to be related to, but we'll listen to the first and we'll listen to the second.
Well, if you don't want, you don't have to get in trouble. If you don't want, you don't have to get in trouble. If you don't want, you don't have to get in trouble, brother. You better leave that lie alone. That liar.
Better leave that liar alone. Now, Ray Charles hears this song and he's thinking, well, what could I do with this? So he comes up with a song, Leave My Woman Alone. We'll see how closely he gets it.
If you don't want, you don't have to. If you don't want, you don't have to. If you don't want, you don't have to. Say you better leave my woman alone.
So we sort of take it from this encouragement to, maybe leave the devil over there to, hey, stay away from my woman. It's fabulous artistry. So, a maybe more subtle version of this, we talked a little bit about Sister Rosetta Tharpe. She actually got in on the act of this as well. She was one of the earlier people that did this. And specifically, the example we're going to hear is a version that she did of a piece by Thomas Dorsey. So Thomas Dorsey we talked about as being one of these really important figures playing both in the blues stream and also in the gospel stream. Thomas Dorsey wrote this wonderful piece for, again, gospel quartet called Hide Me in Thy Bosom.
Oh, Jesus, hear me praying, hear the words I'm saying, must my soul with water from on high. Oh, with the world of sin around me, no evil thoughts can find me. Oh, Savior, if you leave me, I will die. Oh.
Nice and catchy swinging tune here. Sister Rosetta Tharpe had a thought from that as well. She wrote a song that's based on that called Rock Me. Let's get an idea. Let's try to listen for this. It's a little bit more ambiguous than what we've seen with Ray Charles, but you might catch it. We'll look at the lyrics here in a second.
Now, won't you hear me swinging? Hear the words that I'm singing. Much my soul with water from on high. While the world of love is around me, evil thoughts do bite. Oh, if you leave me, I will die.
So as she launches into the chorus here, you really start to get an idea for her influence on rock and roll. Now, let's take a look at these lyrics here, because she did a couple of little tweaks here and there. So obviously, it's very clear in the Thomas Dorsey song that he's addressing this to the Savior. And obviously, in the Rosetta Tharpe version, she's moving this away. It's a little ambiguous what she's singing to. Is she dancing? Is she singing to a lover? Is she singing to the Lord? It's got this little bit of ambiguity in there that was actually kind of upsetting to Thomas Dorsey, who in 1941 wrote an opinion piece that strictly opposed his songs being denigrated in this way or sung in nightclubs. Now, sort of interestingly, Thomas Dorsey had been accused of jazzing gospel music 10 years earlier. So at the same time that he's writing these opinion pieces, he's got in the back of his mind, well, people were getting on me for making songs that swung. So this is a problem. So a third example that we'll go into here is one that actually came from a particularly high financial windfall. Mitty Collier, who was a relatively well-thought of singer in the 50s, had some great success rewriting the songs of a gospel artist named James Cleveland. So I'll give you an example from the James Cleveland catalog here, the song called No Cross, No Crown.
If you can't stand a little disappointment sometimes, if you can't stand being talked about sometimes, listen here. If you think you should always be up and never be down, let me tell you something. No cross, you won't get no crown.
It's just good truth. So Mitty Collier, so excited after having a top 50 song that she had done that was a rewrite of a James Cleveland song, goes and produces another version of one of his songs called No Faith, No Love.
If I can't be alone, sometimes if I can't talk on the telephone, oh baby, sometimes if this means that I'm untrue and I'm fooling around on you, oh, no faith. Well, baby, you have no love.
So she takes this song that's talking about the struggle, and it's about how we're glorified through our struggles. And here she's talking about how she feels like because we can't be apart as lovers, like clearly we must not actually be in love. So it's important to kind of take a quick pause here and think about, like, well, what are these musicians doing? Like, is it sacrilegious, as Kerry Washington's character points out? I think it's valuable for us to remember the words that Jamie Foxx said as Ray Charles, that these are ways for musicians to find their voices. Now, there were definitely versions of this that were financially beneficial, like MIDI Colliers, but we've got another 3 dyads to consider, and I wonder if we can start thinking about a theme that's being transitioned here. What's this common thread that we're seeing sort of redirected and moved around between these tunes? So the next dyads we have are actually moments where gospel musicians had a wonderfully popular soul piece and just changed some lyrics, and now we've got ourselves a nice piece of gospel. It's amazing. So we've already talked a little bit about Hit the Road Jack. I won't go back through and play that one again, but obviously we have this example where Lawrence Roberts and the Angelic Choir did this with they rewrote this as It's the Holy Ghost, if we remember that. And Lawrence Roberts actually did this with a ton of soul music around that time. He would go around with this choir and he would just rewrite soul tunes, and they'd sing them in churches, and they'd get so excited. People would really vibe with what they were doing because it was tunes they were familiar with. Maybe one that you're really familiar with the original version of, that you might not be as familiar with the rewrite of, is the wonderful Stax Axe Sam and Dave. Their wonderful tune, Hold On, I'm Coming, which was obviously anthemic for the Blues Brothers. We'll have a chance to, let's get that back in our ears. Flashed. What's happening? Thank you, Logan. So, in a surprise to no one, what could the rewrite possibly be on Hold On, I'm Coming? It's the simplest solution. Hold on, God's coming. Let's see how successful this is by Mildred Clark and the Melody Airs. So, same song basically.
Don't you ever feel sad? Lean on Jesus when the times are bad. When the day comes and you're in doubt, just call on Jesus, he'll bring you out. Hold on, don't worry, God's coming. Yes, he is. Hold on, keep holding on. He is coming. I know.
That bass player absolutely shreds on that. It's amazing. So, again, we'll have a little bit of a look here at the lyrical differences that we have. You can see how they're slotting words in. So lean on me, lean on Jesus. And obviously we're turning this from an I'm coming, I'm the one that you should be calling on, to, well, who's this person that you should be calling on? We're trying to redirect something here. So the last version of this will be Gladys Knight and the Pips. I would say that this is, that when we listen to that transition, what is it, Ain't That a Pip? So what we'll do is she had an original song called Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me, which some of you may be familiar with.
I've had my share of life's ups and downs. The downs have been few. I guess you could say that I've been lucky.
So she writes this song, and then James Cleveland, who we saw be cribbed going into the soul genre, actually worked with the angelic choir who did all of these versions of Ray Charles tunes and wrote a version of this called The Best Thing as well, but it's Jesus is the Best Thing. And it's actually a really fun recording because it actually calls out Gladys Knight in the middle of it.
I've had my share of life's ups and downs. God's been good to me.
So God's been good to him.
And the downs have been few. Well, I guess you could say God has blessed me. I heard Gladys Knight sing this song the other day. But there's never been a time in my life He didn't bring me through.
Oof. So he really brings the same type of soul to that, but he's clearly directing this in a specific way. And so as we advance through this, maybe, there we go. So it's important here for us to, again, let's kind of root down in what this thematic exchange is. So we've got these gospel tunes that are tunes written between man and God, from the mundane to the divine, from the finite to the infinite, from the created to creator. And we've got these secular tunes, these soul tunes, that are written between person to person, finite to finite, mundane to mundane. But what's curious about this is there's a type of yearning that they're addressing in all of these tunes, this sort of internal something that's yanking on them. And in these sort of gospel music times, they're directing that in a direction that's going up. And in the soul tunes, they're usually directing that in a different direction. They're either inviting someone to come to them, or they're yearning to go to somebody else. So importantly, this isn't a modern phenomenon by any means. Musicians throughout history have imported not only their cultural musical styles, but have sometimes directly used pre-existing melodies. And this, of course, leads me to the most obvious connection that we could possibly make, which is to Martin Luther, the great reformer, which is exactly who I'm sure you were all thinking we would talk about tonight. So Martin Luther obviously had this wonderful role to play in the schism that led to this rise, the creation of Protestantism. And the Protestant Reformation had a wide-ranging effect on the type of worship that people would participate in. There were lots of changes that went through that. Now, in the Protestant split in particular, there were a couple of things that concern us for the conversation we're having today. And specifically, this conversation around the regulative and normative principles of worship. Now, I'm a musicologist. I am not a church historian, so there's a lot more that you can read about these things if you find it fascinating. But sort of Cliff Notes version of this, the regulative principle, which was favored by Calvinists and others, was that anything not directly authorized by or quoting directly from the Bible was to be banned from worship services. And this was essentially a reaction to the potential for something being too novel to Catholicism and maybe being distanced from the scriptures. In the normative principle, this is favored by Luther and others, taught that whatever is not directly prohibited in Scripture is permitted in worship, as long as it's agreeable to peace and unity of the church. So the result of them adopting this normative principle was this burst of new poetry, because no longer did your songs have to be rooted in the Psalms or have to be rooted in a poem from the Old Testament, but they could be perhaps a little bit more tightly written to be about a tenet of the faith and more of a meditation on that. And so you had this burst of poetry coming out. Luther himself was a hymn writer. He wrote about 36 hymns of his own. And there was a problem that was addressed at some points by Luther and other composers of the time, where they would set their words in different styles. So in some cases, they might replace the words from a Catholic liturgical tune to make it more specifically related to Protestant philosophy. they would replace some of the words and adapt the music to fit it. So for example, a tune that was in Latin, you're trying to translate it into German, the melody doesn't work anymore. You're going to change that a little bit. And then additionally, they would actually adapt words and they would borrow from secular tunes. This sounds a little familiar. And so 2 examples here, we'll only listen to one of these, is on the left here, Innsbruck, I Must Leave You, which Martin Luther, and it's kind of attributed a couple different ways, eventually became the tune, O World, I Must Leave You. So just to get a little bit of that ear for this, it's pretty closely related. So let's hear a little bit of the Isaac, perhaps. And this rewrite that we used in the Protestant tradition would be, O World, I Must Leave You, which again, we're redirecting what we're thinking about here. Not necessarily the land that we're leaving, but additionally this ascension. There we go. So additionally, this song that I have on the right here, From Distant Land I Come to You, which Martin Luther rewrote, was initially more of a love song. I came from far away so that I can be near to you. And Martin Luther rewrote it as a Christmas tune that he would sing for his family and additionally be sung in worship settings. So there is something relatively familiar here as we think about these things. So in both cases, we have folk music and popular music, but music that would be coming out of the culture. So we have gospel music borrowing from soul. So these would be people, like music folks were already familiar with. We're rewriting it and recasting it into this more sacred context. You see the same thing with Luther and folk. Now, again, in both cases, they're relatively choosy about the music that they use. Luther was very careful not to pick things like drinking songs, no rhythmic dance songs of the time. And with the artists in the gospel and the soul exchange, you typically found people recasting love songs. They were specifically talking about this internal yearning. Now, there is a uniqueness here that most German folk music would have been influenced by German sacred music because the German church was the predominant culture of the time. So the two would have been relatively close in style anyway. Now, interestingly, soul as a genre grew out of gospel music, so gospel music taking from soul sort of is this own little, eating its own tail. So, as we're thinking about this, and we're, sort of lots of little smiles and laughs as we've been going through these things, it almost does seem like parody. This type of taking a music and changing the words to it kind of brings to mind things like Weird Al Yankovic and some of these more parody type singers. But there's another type of parody that's actually very similar to this as well, but it's the medieval parody mass. So the Catholics also got in on the act here, borrowing from secular music and sticking it into their sacred music. So here's a couple of examples of that where you would have a secular song like L'Homme Armé, or there was one who was dear to me, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, that were written not as sacred music, but would be inserted directly into Catholic masses. And so one example we'll go through briefly here is Missa L'Homme Armé. And some of you may remember a couple years ago we did a modern mass that was based on L'Homme Armé. At the time, even now, there are 40 extant versions of masses written on this particular tune that are 500 years old. So we've got that very strong sound in our eyes, this idea that we need to be aware of the armed man as he comes through. Now I wonder if there's a way that we could sneak that into a Christ Have Mercy. Let's see. Let's look at this third line here. What do we see? very subtly and very slowly, we work that song directly into the Mass as well. Now, at a certain point, the Council of Trent comes in and they end the fun of parodies. Their criticism specifically for music writing was that they wanted things to be, they were worried about things creeping into the music that endangered people's ability to understand the words. So being distracted by familiar tunes or things like polyphony where the music would be kind of all floating around each other, they tried to move away from that for clarity. So in the same way that gospel music is pursuing clarity in short, repetitious phrases, we've had this desire in our sacred music writing for a long time. So we've got to see these examples of exchanges and borrowings going on between sacred, potentially liturgical music and secular music. And there are some themes that we can pull out of these different points. So again, this underlying yearning, this idea of how do we actually transact between each other or between us and the divine. And there's a few takeaways that we'll sort of end with here as we come to the close of this conversation. There'll be some time for questions at the end if you like. And so there's three things that specifically stood out to me as I was kind of thinking through these things. And the first in particular is the effect of melody and rhythm on text. So having a really great match between the rhythm of your words, the rhythm of your music, and the words in your music can really help bring those things out. It's the Holy Ghost. Like it very much matters. It patterns itself after our natural speech. Melodies as well can do this. If you think about the way that a lot of these melodies are written in this sort of rising motion, leading us to their choruses, really helped us kind of think about these strivings and strains that we might feel from this internal yearning. These downwards things that come at the end of them might indicate rest. The repetition may indicate importance. So the effect of melody and rhythm can be it really stands out as you consider these things. Flowing out of that is the importance of the vernacular. And right here is a great quote from Martin Luther. Both text and music, accentuation, melody, and gait or tempo must come from the true mother tongue and voice. So it was very important to him that the music that we're using bears some resemblance to the way that we speak and the culture that we live in, this idea of contextualizing. So obviously, as we think about vernacular, we might think about the fact that we're all standing here speaking English. But additionally, there's a type of music that we're all swimming in as well. And he had some thought about that. And also that we need to have care in choosing these tunes to borrow. Does the subject matter of this original tune matter? Well, to Luther, it definitely did. This second example that I had up there, the one that was a rewrite of a love song, From Distant Land I Come to You, becoming From Heaven Above I Come. He actually initially wrote that based on this love song, but was so concerned about the underlying love sort of like affecting people that he rewrote the melody into what we now know as Von Himmel Hoch. So these are sort of the things that occurred to me as I was going through this. There's also a question of the legality of all of these things, especially now. That's a whole conversation for another time. But I wanted to thank you all so much for your time tonight. I want to leave you with this, and like I said, I'll give Jennifer a link to a playlist of all the pieces that we would have run through today for your listening pleasure as you go along. And just to leave you here, like I said, I am a part of a larger series of projects that we do up at our offices just about 2 miles away. This is what we have coming up this month. If you want to come and join us, we'd love to see you up there. Thank you all so much for your time tonight. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, we can certainly chat about that. I found this to be super fun, so thank you all. Yes, ma'am. Your name? Gina. Hello. I'm going to come down.
This is a conversation for another time, but I'm curious about when the borrowing became an issue of plagiarism and, people suing each other.
Yeah.
Was there an understanding back then that maybe they were all kind of in the same boat, so they wanted to share the music, or what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So Gina's question was about the legality of this and when would it have been that many of these laws came in. And so overall, I would highly recommend a wonderful, so I'll answer your question first. And so this type of borrowing sort of outpaced our current plagiarism and copyright laws as they pertain to music. And so this was going on at a time, even in the 50s, where we didn't have in place the mechanisms for that to go on. We started seeing more of those issues coming up as we were moving into the 60s, and you see a lot of this borrowing going back and forth. And this is where a lot of our modern our music copyright law sort of starts to become really closely knit and created. And so sort of interestingly, I think you speak to an important point, which is that if our current legal landscape was as it is now, then this genre really wouldn't exist because of how tightly tied those two genres were. If you have a curiosity about this, I cannot recommend to you highly enough actually a comic book by Duke University called Theft, which actually traces the history of musical borrowing and some of the ways that copyright, before it became copyright law, was an issue already, especially as it pertained to what was acceptable being moved back and forth between sacred and secular spaces. So I know it is a crazy looking cover. It is available for free on the Duke University's, their law school's webpage. This is super fun. I'll put a link to it in the Google document that I have as well. Were there any other questions? Yes. Yes. So the things that I have up on the screen here are actually going to be going on at our offices over on East Thompson Peak. If you go to azmusicfest.org and click on where it says Music Alive, you'll see all of these things listed on there. We've got Music and Muffins, which are discussion groups where we essentially just have a playlist of things. Rebecca, I know you come to a number of those. We have a playlist that we listen to and we just sort of talk about what we're hearing. It's a little bit more of a discussion than it is a lecture. We've got a couple of lectures going on. Eckhart Selheim is coming up to do a wonderful conversation on the pianoforte of Beethoven's time. He's actually going to bring up a replica of a 17th century piano or an 18th century pianoforte and kind of deconstruct that alongside of the Steinway we have in the office. We've got a drum circle on the 26th. If you want to come and like work out some of the last year, it'd be a great time to come up there and hang out, bring some earplugs. But yeah, it'll be a good time. Any other questions?
So Ben, we're going to, your listening links are going to be online at the website under Ben's lecture. So Logan's going to put them on the website. So you can just go to the website, look under Ben Baer for today, and click on those. And what are these all different times?
Yeah. So some of I didn't want to fill the screen up too much. So let's see. The lectures and Music and Muffins are at 10 o'clock in the morning. The film will be at 3:30. The drum circle will be at 4. And yeah, if you just click through on that, it'll have the times there for you and opportunities to RSVP. So that way I know you're coming. I can set a chair out for you.
The one thing I know about Ben is that when he talks about any kind of music, he has such knowledge about it. And so you notice he was kind of rocking out with all these different, some of these I've never even heard of, but even when he's talking about, whether he's talking about Beethoven or Stravinsky, he loves it, and he has specific links that you can listen to, or music examples like he had up on the screen today. So it's super fun to come to any of Ben's lectures that he has
Jennifer.
up here. And any other questions? Yes,
Sir.
Larry.
Have you actually been able to go to the Rock and Soul Museum in Memphis?
I have gone past it, but I have not gone in. I got to pop down in there, absolutely. Yeah, I grew up in Northeast Ohio, so when they built the Rock Hall, that was always the place we went. Absolutely. So we cannot recommend the Rock and Soul Museum in Memphis enough. So we will all maybe take a field trip there next year. Sound good? Once we can all travel really nicely, maybe we'll do like a road trip out there. That'd be a little bit more fun. But yeah, thank you all so much for your time tonight. Have a wonderful evening. I was like, is that me? It's like, I'm not talking. What's happening?